there, welcome to a fresh episode of Chasing the Vision. We are on episode 11, which is very exciting. I am joined by our two wonderful industry experts, Tim Hull, who's the GM of Violand Management Associates, and JT Cry, who's the founder of Exit Strategies. To date, we've had more than 1,500 listens and views, as well as like hundreds more interactions on social media with the posts and the small clips we put out there. So thank you so much to our audience and those of you who are listening. I get little feedbacks here and there, and I know there are people that are excited specifically when this series comes out. So thank you for engaging with us. If there are things that you want us to talk about in the future, also please feel free to let us know. So far, we've discussed topics like family business dynamics, financial cleanliness, your customer base, the roles of owners and leaders and managers in your company, all of those great things. So this month, the month of November, which is kind of right in tandem with Violand Management Associates doing their annual business planning conferences, we wanted to talk about business planning. It seems like there are a lot of different types of planning that businesses can go through. And I know like on the vendor side, I'm also working with a lot of companies on the vendor side doing their business planning. So we wanted to talk about what that looks like, kind of give some tips and tricks to do the best planning that you can ahead of the start of a new year. So Tim, I'm going to toss it over to you first because Violand is really like the top expert in business planning. I'm curious for one, as I kick this over to you, how long has Violand been doing business planning retreats like you've been doing? And give some thoughts as to why business planning seems like such a challenge for contractors.
Yeah, absolutely. So, don't quote me on this, Michelle, but I guess this is being being recorded. So I think we're in our 27th or 28th year doing this.
Wow.
And the reason we chose to do it kind of in the format that we did it with a retreat was because we felt it was important to get business owners out and away from their business.
Mhm.
We've had several clients that attempt to do it by staying at home and gathering the team, which is fine. I mean, one of the advantages I think they have there is their team is there, but unfortunately, all the distractions that happen in day-to-day business go along with it. So
Yes.
we feel it's important that you kind of get out of the office and get away from the daily grind and allow yourself to focus. So the retreats have been a great success for us. And every year they keep getting bigger and bigger. And it's nice to be able to sit down with people in sort of a more intimate setting rather than a conference.
Mhm.
It's why we call it a retreat, and be able to spend some one-on-one time with them thinking about their plan for the coming year.
They are pretty amazing events, that's for sure. I will vouch for that. Okay, so why do you think restoration contractors get stuck in the idea of planning? Is it because it's too big of a task to undertake? They don't know where to start? Like where do restorers get stuck? Why is planning so hard?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's hard. It is hard. I think, this business is very active, and I think people get, again, caught up in the day-to-day thing. So consciously taking the time to set aside a few hours or a few days to really think about where your business is going and work on your business is difficult for most. So you're not alone in that regard, but I think people get kind of stuck with where do you start? How do you go about doing it? And I think when people think of a business plan, they think of this charts and graphs and big fancy presentations that you might give to investors or bankers to show them what your business is all about. But we take a little bit different approach. We try to be as active and hands-on, a little bit closer to the ground level as we can, so that you create something that's actionable that you can actually use when you go back home. But from a high level standpoint, I think knowing how to get started is an important part of what we do. And I think that's the reason why we see so many people return year after year is because we gave them the ability to get started, and now they can kind of focus on what they need to do. At a lower level, I mean, really, we create excuses for ourselves, and present company included, right? I mean, you get into this time of year and you go, all right, I got to start thinking about next year. I got to create a budget. What do we need to focus on? So there's a lot going on there, and we create every excuse under the book as to why we shouldn't do it,
Mhm.
and as opposed to just making it a routine, disciplined part of business in general.
Okay, so JT, add a little bit into this. When you talk to restorers who are maybe thinking about their exit strategy and thinking about, it could be maybe they've had an exit strategy for 20 years and now they've reached the point of retiring and they're selling to an employee or somebody else or whatever. How important, or is there a big difference between the companies that you've seen who have done, you're smiling already, done good business planning and have not? Is there a difference? Can you tell the difference when they come to you?
I can, and I have to get the smile off my face because you said if an owner has is if they've had an exit strategy for 20 years, if that person exists, Michelle, please introduce them to me. I'd love to meet them. I'm sure Tim and I both would.
Yeah.
So there is a planning season when it comes to an exit strategy, and it's not the week before or a month before. Tim said it's hard, and it is. It's uncomfortable, but it's not as hard as people think it is when it comes to exit planning. The season is typically 3 to 5 years, and I'll kind of stand on 3 years as a minimum, and that can get short circuited with family and health and circumstances and life. It just gets in the way. But 3 years gives you a nice, solid platform to work with to get your business cleaned up and talk about wealth preservation and tax planning and estate planning and make sure all your T's are crossed and I's are dotted. Um, some flat out ignore what exit planning is and isn't, and it's unfortunate because if when an owner is staring into this black hole of unknown, it's uncomfortable because as owners we're paid to have answers, right? I mean, where everyone comes to our desk and they expect us to know, and oftentimes we do, and to the listeners, we do have answers. We know our business in theory as well as anybody. When we don't have answers, it's tough to ask. And so the unknown there delays people search for answers. And it really leads to the comment I hear regularly, which is, I should have called you 2 or 3 years ago when the thought of selling first crossed my mind. And when you get a call late, and as an owner, if you get answers late, it just severely hamstrings your options, and it's unfortunate.
So, JT, really quick, when you have somebody come to you who's thinking, okay, I'm maybe ready to sell, but you look at their company inside and it's like, okay, we need to do a little bit more. What's the first thing that you tell them as far as maybe the business side? Like, what's step one of you need to create a more structured business plan? Where do you start?
Well, the first thing I do is just give good answers. Both Tim and I give great answers when it comes to planning. And I don't have an agenda. I'm not on anybody's timing committee. And what I do is one of the hardest things to do actually is get an owner to view their business as a buyer would, or as a lender would, or the buyer's CPA.
Mhm.
If you can do that, you're light years ahead of many. And when they understand what's important to buyers, it helps drive decisions on the people's exit ramp, owners' exit ramp as they approach selling. And so the first thing we do is deliver solid data. You just get good answers so you make good decisions. And then I love to model. I love to do financial modeling. So if a potential seller reaches out and they say, hey, or I let them know it's a 10 or $12 million business now. But if we changed a few things, if we grew organically for a year or two and we cleaned up this and we changed a couple of these variables, you're worth 12.5, 24 months from now. Well, now make your decision. You can either sell now or sell later, but I certainly would be remiss if I didn't let owners know that. So I think solid information leads to solid decisions. And that's how I start every client engagement.
Okay. All right. So, Tim, I have kind of a two-part question for you. One, when it comes to business planning, who should be involved? I know when I think about the retreats, there's, two, three, four employees typically per company, kind of depending who should be involved. And then at what point do you take the planning beyond that smaller group to the larger company as a whole?
Right. So for most of the folks that are our listening audience, you're probably somewhere under 30 or 40 employees. So I would say get as many people involved in that planning process at some degree as you possibly can. Now, the way our system is set up, we have a bunch of preparatory work that needs to be done and a series of meetings laid out on a schedule that we recommend that those business owners have with their staff prior to coming to the retreat. So you're gathering information, feedback from a lot of different avenues. It could be a little bit more high level stuff like, what does the operations department need as far as resources and support for the coming year to accomplish the objectives. It could be something as simple with a technician as, hey, give me your wish list. If you have a tool that you didn't have now, what would it be? All of those things are kind of going to integrate into the larger plan and craft those objectives for the coming year. So to directly answer your question, I would get as many people involved in the planning process as you can, but do it at a variety of levels so that when you actually sit down and compose the plan, it can be done with a handful of just close management, high level management employees in your organization.
Sure.
Now, as far as going back to the team, I've seen it done a bunch of different ways. I think the most effective way that I've seen it done is in a presentation format. So I had a couple clients that did this with good success. So they would have I call it a year-end party, holiday, type party between Thanksgiving and Christmas, or shortly after the first of the year, where they would roll out the plan in a presentation format with the entire staff there. Now, when you break that down into departments and you talk about allocating budgetary authority to certain managers, you'll want to do that in a private meeting. Here's the budget you've got for the coming year, and it should line up with what the objectives are for the organization.
JT, do you have anything to add into that? I'm curious on your end. It's got to be different. I mean, if people are looking toward exiting and maybe changing up their business planning for a few years before the exit, does that change who's involved?
It does. Exit planning can be confidential, of course. It should be.
Mhm.
Now, it doesn't mean that when an owner is 65 or 70 years old, it's not a big shock when somebody's thinking about selling. But oftentimes, when a true owner is exit planning, it may involve a GM, it might involve a controller, and it typically stops there. Unless the heir to the business might be a GM, which is commonly the case, or an ops manager, a lead PM, estimator, etc. But your circle is much smaller on on the ramp of exit planning. It's limited until those key employees need to be brought in.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to note, like to delineate the difference between exit planning and strategic planning. So
yes,
when we're talking strategic planning, we're talking day-to-day operations, long-term and kind of intermediate growth of the organization. Boil that down into short-term objectives for the coming year.
Sure.
Yep.
That stuff needs to be done whether you're going to prepare the business to sell or not.
Yes.
So
correct.
I've always told business owners, you need to keep your foot on the gas all the way until closing day. So whatever discussions need to be had, when we get into these conversations frequently where a client will say, well, I'm entertaining an offer, or I'd like to entertain offers in the coming year. How do I keep that from the staff or share that with the staff?
Yeah.
Well, that degree of transparency is totally up to the owner and their staff. But if you're gonna keep it confidential in nature, you've got two different things we're talking about here.
Yes.
And I would keep the sale discussions or the succession discussions separate from the strategic plan.
That was perfect.
Yeah, that's a great clarification.
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah.
That's exactly what I was going for. So thank you. That's perfect. Okay. All right. So Tim, tossing it back to you, what are some of the micro challenges that you see companies coming into business planning with, especially maybe some of the ones that have done, well, let's do both sides. Ones that are doing this for the very first time, and then what do the challenges become once, there's repeats that have been doing this year after year after year? There has to be challenges that they face that are different than the beginners.
Right. We've got a pretty broad perspective on this one, Michelle. I mean, this year we're going to see probably over 150 companies come through from all throughout the US, Canada, Australia, throughout of our retreats. So we get to see a lot of this, what we call the new planners to us, and we try to segregate those groups. So we've got a couple different sessions. One is geared more towards the new planners who aren't used to our sessions, and then the others are those who have been doing it 3 or 4 more years with us. There's a big difference to how they approach it. So as far as like the challenges that they deal with, the group that's new to planning is always challenged with how to write the plan.
Yeah.
So there's the how to plan, and then there's the content of the plan. So there's really 2 objectives there. So I would say the new ones kind of fall into that category of getting used to writing a plan, at least using the style that we try to teach our clients. But I think beyond that, they all struggle with the same challenges. And it's the same ones year over year over year. The biggest one is clarity of vision. They have an idea of what they want from the business or what the business should look like in a successful state in the future. They have a hard time articulating it. Now, advances in technology today have been great, and ChatGPT is probably a wonderful thing for these folks. But we encourage them, hey, just write a bulleted list. Give me some ideas, thoughts, process, like just tell me something, put some words on a page. We can dump that into an AI platform and say, create a vision statement from this
Yeah.
for me. And you take care of the English language, you take that difficulty out of it, right? But really reaching some clarity on where the business is going and what it looks like in a successful state is probably the biggest one. The other thing we see is that the folks have a tendency to get stuck in the weeds. And I just had a conversation this morning with a client talking to him. This will be his third year going through the process. Talking to him about how he's approaching it differently this year than he had been in the past. And he said, we were focused way down here, like I need to buy 2 trucks, I need to hire 2 more people,
Mm.
we were like the day-to-day minutia. But all of those items that you're doing at sort of the task and the project and the activity level have to lead up to something.
Mhm.
And we can get into a lot of different rabbit holes, especially during the planning process, about things, task-oriented items that need to be done. It's really the owner's job, senior management's job to keep that conversation focused and keep bringing it back to some level of goals or objectives. So if that item doesn't relate directly to one of those things, well, then it's probably not real high on the priority list. They all have to be what we call congruent in nature, where they all have to be connected in one way, shape, or form. But the other thing too, Michelle, that we see, and JT, you'll love this, is making a correlation between what you want to accomplish in the plan and some sort of financial performance metric.
Mm.
Because we save the budgeting process, the pro forma, for the last day of the retreat, and that's the last item that gets done. Well, that's intentional. Because you can write a budget, you can start a budget now, but there's things that you may be planning for, capital purchases, training, development, and if another strategic initiative that's going to cost money. All that has to be budgeted for and accounted for in the pro forma that you put together. So tying the action that you're going to put forth in the plan and the financial performance metric, the result on the other side, is really critically important. You can't have one with the other. The results, the metrics, are a direct relation with the decisions that are made during the planning process.
That makes good sense. So, okay, JT, I most of the conversations I'm framing to you in this conversation, I just want to let the audience know, are more related to you've evaluated probably thousands of companies at this point. You've looked inside thousands of companies. So you have seen the difference between companies that have had really good strategic planning and companies that maybe have not, or they've been good at looking at their short-term goals or long-term goals. So that's more what we're talking about, I think, when I ask you questions here versus evaluation and selling, even though this needs to be part of your exit
Sure.
strategy. I hate to tell all of you listening, but business planning. So, all right. So, if you peel back the veil and think about the companies that you have evaluated and looked at over the years, what is the difference between some of the ones that have been good at maybe like short-term planning? They come to you and they're maybe ready to go versus that long-term, long vision look. You talked a little bit about how the valuation can change, but what else have you seen? How does it change how a company is?
Well, one of the biggest changes is I think it leads to quality of life. And I know that's a big answer. It leads to quality of ownership. There's so many owners can't see past Friday or the end of the month. They just have a hard time doing it. They're making decisions on the fly out in the field, and it brings short-term planning to a whole new level. There is no planning except the day-to-day decisions, and that's really a tough way to run a business. And so when Tim asked them to think, or the VMA consultants ask them to think long term, some people just give you the deer in the headlight look. They have never thought long term.
Mhm.
And so when you ask them to go there, it's just a complete shock. And it's no way to run a successful business. I mean, it might get you to Friday, but it's not going to get you to the end of the year successfully, or 4, 5, 6 years down the road. And so, I think one of the biggest challenges is owners understanding the benefit, the real ROI of the dedicated benefit, getting to Canton, getting to Florida, getting to these retreats. If they knew the outcome
Mhm.
and what it was going to do for them, I think they'd be lined up to get into these VMA events to really execute this planning. The long-term benefits are so different than what they experience on a day-to-day. And I've sold several companies that have been through the VMA planning, and from top to bottom, they're just cleaner, they're better organized, and there's more of a strategic thought process dedicated to the business instead of just the fireman approach and putting out fires left and right as they come up. So I can't say enough about what Viola is doing.
I'd love to hear stories. Pause for a minute and hear a story from either of you to kind of give a real world example of maybe Tim, a company you saw years ago come into business planning and they've been doing it for a while and how much that has truly transformed their business.
Yeah, we actually had a couple examples of that, Michelle. And I don't want to turn this into a commercial for Violand management,
All
but
right.
to JT's point, the value of having a strategic plan and what that means at sell time, if that's inevitably where you're going. We had a client, I actually had a buyer approach me looking for somebody, and I knew that this person was kind of like in that process already, starting to think in that 3 to 5 year window you were talking about, JT.
Mhm.
And I mean, we're talking about buckets of money to the bank every month. And we sent them, the information. But along with that, we also were able to send them a dozen years worth of written strategic plans from this company. And they paid top dollar for that business. I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 7.5 times EBITDA, which was a great deal for the client. And then the buyer turned around and told us, who else do you have for sale? And they ended up approaching three more of our clients that same year, and got all those deals done too. And they all followed that same pattern where they had a verifiable asset that they could show that buyer to say, hey, look, we are a disciplined organization and this is how we went about it. It's not the content of the plan, it's the fact that you took the time every year to work on the business and carefully craft and plan, where you were going to go with that business in the years to come.
Okay, Tim, really quick, JT, before I toss it to you for a story, dig into that discipline comment a little bit. What do you have a time of year that you recommend, putting Violand business planning aside, at the time of year you recommend a business start doing their business planning, and when should they have it wrapped up and pretty much like this is our plan for the year done by? I know that things can change, so I know it's not like set in stone. These aren't the 10 commandments here, but what does the timeline look like?
Me or JT?
Tim, sorry.
I mean, we recommend that they start the planning process about 8 weeks before our retreats. Now, our retreats occur in October and November. That's only because most people have a fiscal year that mirrors the calendar year.
Mhm.
If you're different than that, let's say your fiscal year starts in July, then you're going to want to back that up and start planning a month or two ahead of that date so that you've got the budget. But really, the budget and the fiscal year are the driving factors there. You can do strategic planning anytime.
Mhm.
We did a program up in Canada earlier this year for a Canadian franchise, and it was a great experience for everybody that was there, present company included, because there was a lot of French speakers there. We had to do a lot through translation. That was an interesting endeavor for us. But all that stuff aside, you can work on the strategic plan. You can write it at any time during the year, but we do recommend that you start it in enough time that the budget is at least set by the time the new fiscal year starts.
Okay, that makes sense. All right. So, JT, I'm going to toss the stories question over to you and maybe a story of how you've seen a company transform from going from maybe no business plan or a really rough around the edges one to a more sophisticated plan and how that changed the company.
There's both Tim and I could tell dozens of horror stories and success stories. I mean, they're almost endless. I think one of the we'll tell a success story. They're much more fun to tell than the horror stories. There's a client in the Upper Midwest that I've valued 6 times now over the last 14 years. About every other year, we value them, and it's for incoming key employees. They've got stock appreciation rights and unit appreciation rights where it's ownership comes and goes based on age and people retiring and younger teams coming in. That company is so dialed in and so ready to go. When they decide to pull the trigger, it'll command top dollar, both financially and culturally. There's only going to be a handful of buyers out there that will know what to do with that culture because it's so dialed in. I've sold some really clean companies in the past that have been through the Violand system. And I remember very clearly, I approached an industry strategic, and I won't say which one. And I showed him the sim, explained who it was. And his comment to me was, JT, they're way too cool for us. We wouldn't know what to do with them. What does that say about what some buyers expect?
That's quite
it's
a
really,
compliment.
it was astonishing. And so there's no bad thing that can come from planning. And if the people want to take the time, if owners really want to take the time, there's a lot of success stories that are still to be made out there.
Okay, so I want to touch on something, JT, that you just said. Does culture play a role in planning? Are we just looking at like the numbers and our like business plans to buy a truck, or we want to grow 10% this year, or we want to grow our mitigation department or whatever? Does culture have a role in business planning? JT, go ahead. You have some thoughts I can
Well,
tell.
it does, yeah. And this is really Tim's lane, so I'm going to
Okay.
talk briefly here and then kick it right over to Tim. But culture does play a role. When I start to plan with a client and I ask them to start planning, we all look at the numbers first. That sets the stage.
Mhm.
However, we know that there's a lot of variables that drive value outside of the numbers. And if that culture isn't right, if there's a high level of turnover, if there's a lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of chatter, your workers' comp rates, your mod rates, um, the employee tenure, there's things that are going to show up in your metrics that can be a result of that culture, and it erodes confidence for a buyer because a buyer eventually is buying your team, and they need that set of key employees to be really good, really dependable, dialed in, be part of the plan. And it all shows up in culture in my world. And so we do get down into the weeds because we've got to eventually sell that to buyers. But that's enough for me. Tim, why don't you take it from there? How's that?
Well, I loved your comment about you. They're way too cool for us.
It's awesome.
I mean, personally, if I was a buyer and I was looking at any company that was out there, I would consider it a differentiator, Michelle.
Mhm.
And I don't think there's a company out there that's too cool for anybody. To me, you should be looking for companies that are cooler than you, because it's not just asset acquisition. You're looking at talent and leadership and management acquisition. And if you can acquire a company and learn the disciplines, or realize the disciplines that they've got as an organization that got them to where they are today, maybe you got something to learn. So to me, there's a ton of value there. Kind of bringing it a little closer to home, I'm thinking more towards the employees. Everybody's battling for good employees. Top talent is, it's one of the number one wars that are waged in any direct labor business. So having a way that you can set yourself apart from other companies, the planning is an outward mechanism or a display of the culture that you've instilled. It Companies plan, good companies with good culture plan. So having that to be able to show to a prospective employee to say, hey, look, we've got it together here. We're not just your fly by night, what I call ladder rack contractor that's got a magnetic sign on our vehicles. No offense to the listeners that do, but we're an organization here. We are a bona fide business, and this is a discipline that is part of business, and this is how we do things.
Okay. And I agree on what you said. Like, there's a lot to be learned and adopted from companies that are acquired. And there are some groups in the industry that are acquiring people that really, really, really know what they're doing, and they're able to bring those fruits into the bigger network of companies. So
Yep.
yes, there is immense value there. Okay. I'm curious, both of you, what blind spots you see owners coming into business planning with. Tim, maybe I'll toss this one over to you first. Are there blind spots where you're constantly, you feel like you're constantly going up to tables and being like, well, did you think about this? Did you think about this? What are some blind spots?
Yeah, I think that it's the biggest one is the owner's fear of accountability. I mean, I'm serious. It's one thing to say something, hey, let's go do this, or we should go in this direction with the business, but when you put it in writing,
Uh-huh.
you now have an entire staff that can hold you accountable for that commitment. So I think from a blind spot perspective, that's probably the biggest reason why. Hey, I'm putting this thing in the plan. We actually have to do this now. But the other one, everybody, I don't want to say everybody, but a lot of business owners have a fear of rocking the boat. Maybe it's conflict avoidance, maybe it's not, I don't know. But the planning process, the best planning processes involve very critical conversations. I mean, they can be contentious, they can be, sometimes heated. but those are great conversations to have. If you're debating, one of our guys had come up with the term sparring. If you can't spar within your organization, we're not talking about fighting, knocking somebody out. We're talking about a bona fide critical conversation about a business initiative. If you can't have that type of interaction, you're probably not going to get the best ideas out of a plan. But you have to get past that initial hesitancy to create a little bit of constructive conflict in your organization. So those are my two big ones, Nicole, Michelle.
Okay. That's, I was thinking about, so last year, I'll offer a little insight on my part. I started the Violand business planning process last year. I had all of the pre-paperwork, I had all of that. And the planning process does tend to reveal truths that maybe you as the owner, as you were talking about, Tim, doesn't want to admit to. And there were some truths that were revealed on my end that meant some things that I needed to hold myself accountable for. And planning ended up looking a little bit different for me. I had to shift some things around a little bit, but the planning process really for me did start to reveal some things that, and it didn't so much have to do with numbers or growth or whatever. It had to do more with the team and how we were structured and the right people, right seats. So it is going to reveal a lot of truths to you, whether you like it or not, but that can be helpful in the long run to push your business to the next level. So that's my little bit of insight there. So
So
JT,
Michelle,
go
yeah,
ahead.
before it comes to me, let me continue on that vein for a second. Not all those truths can be negative or should be negative. What was the best part about your journey on the Violand plan?
Um, I actually really liked the structure of it because I was definitely
Okay.
in that boat of I don't know where to start. I'm a very new business owner. I was very green, and my goal had been to do business planning for a few years. And so when I got the files and downloaded it, actually, not trying to make this an ad for Violand, I promise, but it was, as somebody who was completely overwhelmed by the process, I was relieved when I saw like, okay, this isn't a big hurdle that you have to, a big elephant all at once. You don't have to eat it all at once. You are taking bites as you go. So you are able to weed through those things as you go. You guys know I'm getting my MBA as well. So some of it was actually coinciding with some of my MBA work at the time as well. And so it all just married together really nicely to help me kind of figure out the structure of the company, which I hadn't before. And some of the more almost like basic business things that hadn't happened because we were in startup mode so quickly when I first got the magazine. So
Great question.
Perfect. Yeah, you need a few more irons in the fire, Michelle.
no more irons in the fire.
That's right.
8 months till graduation, and then we're moving on.
Oh, terrific.
Yeah. Okay. So JT, I'm going to toss it over to you to talk about blind spots. Are there any blind spots that you see some of your clients have had when they're doing their business planning?
There is, and I mentioned one already, and that is just the desire to view their business differently.
Mhm.
The thing that I hear the most, and it makes my head explode, is when somebody says, why is that an issue? We've always done it this way. And it doesn't mean that that's the right way to do it. It just means that it's worked for you and your internal systems, but it doesn't mean it works for anybody else. And so when I hear that, I just cringe on the inside because there's a lot of great perspectives to a business. So it's sort of taking the blinders off and a little bit wider perspective. And then once they do, it's managing the expectations that they find. They don't know what the options are when it comes to planning or long-term planning, especially when it comes to exit strategy planning. And so they hear things at conferences, at summits, sitting around the bar, drinking with their friends. Somebody got 20 times earnings for their business, and all of a sudden that's normal for them. Well, what does that mean? 20 times what? And so a lot of times I'm just managing expectations because of assumptions they've made or things they've heard, which are probably taken completely out of context. And so I do a lot of expectation management, we'll say, early on, because what they think they know might be correct, and we hope it is. But if it isn't, it's my job to say, no, that isn't quite how it works. And we hope that we can get that, but here's the reality or the top of the bell curve of how these things typically fall. Both for Tim and I, our job is to maximize the cleanliness and professionalism of a business, and we're all rowing the same direction. And so when people come in with some of their own thoughts, these blind spots that are really big hindrances, sometimes the hardest thing to do is to just get them to change their view of thinking. And Tim, you probably have found that as well. But if we can get them to open up a little bit with their field of vision, then the sky's the limit.
Yeah, and Michelle, if I could just kind of throw one more on the table relative to what he just said.
Yeah.
This is a strategic exercise.
Yeah.
So planning isn't about just identifying the things that you need to do to put on a checklist for the coming year. One of the big things that is really important to the planning process is a SWOT analysis and identifying the things you're good at, the things you're not good at as an organization, but also pairing those or coupling those with external opportunities and threats is huge. That's how businesses get to where they want to be in the future. So I think, people are pretty good at least looking in the mirror and identify, okay, yeah, I know we're not that great in that area, we're good in this area, and this is something we excel at. But one of the blind spots there in that exercise is looking at the external influences that are on the business. So they could be economic, they could be legislative, they could be environmental, they could be, the list goes on. But these are all the things that are happening in the world around us, advances in technology. I mean, we're talking about how AI is going to change how we work. All those things need to be taken into consideration, and looking at what you're good at and what you're not good at, being able to capitalize on your strengths to take advantage of something that's out there that's happening around you is probably the most common strategy for how businesses grow. I mean, it could be simple as a demographic change. Your population in your service market's either shrinking or it's growing. One of the two. They're going to present opportunities and threats correspondingly. So look outside of your own four walls. I guess if I had to give somebody some advice, pay attention to what's going on around you, and then use what you know about your business to react and plan accordingly.
Great advice. Yes. React and plan accordingly. That kind of ties into, Tim, the conversation you and I had offline last week, talking about being prepared for big events in your area, being prepared to respond, finding those opportunities that maybe you aren't currently ready for. So, okay, before we wrap it up, I just want to ask, as people are going into business planning or thinking about business planning, what advice would you offer owners or GMs or whoever it is going into the business planning process? What is like your number one piece of advice? So JT, I'll toss this one to you first. Number one piece of advice.
From my seat, it's simple, Michelle. The sooner the better. And I know I don't want to sound like a broken record, but there's no regrets that way.
Yep.
And the biggest issue is owners being nervous. My advice is if you're a little nervous, ask nervous. If you're uncertain or a little bit afraid, well, ask uncertain or a little bit afraid. The answers are what they are. There isn't a single bad outcome by planning early. And if you wait, there's dozens of bad outcomes. So if you're a little afraid, just ask afraid, and instantly your confidence is going to be boosted, and the road ahead will be clear.
Okay, perfect. All right, Tim, I'll toss it to you. Top advice.
I would concur. Rip off the Band-Aid. If you haven't done it, business planning is kind of like working out. It's tough to get motivated to do it, but I don't think anybody, complains or regrets doing it when they did it, right? It's tough to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go to the gym, but usually by 9 o'clock you feel pretty good about going. It's the days that you don't go and don't do it that you feel lousy. But we've seen a lot of companies come through our planning retreats, and my favorite ones are the ones that the business owner that comes by himself for the first time and sits at that table in a room full of dozens of other companies and puts his head down and writes something and shows us and says, is this good? And then 5 years later, he's sitting there with his entire staff. So that, to me, that is rewarding. Take the leap, tear the Band-Aid off, do whatever cliche term you want to use, but just do it.
Yep, just do it. All right. Anything else that either of you want to add before we wrap it up? I'll do a quick teaser but I want to make sure that you see if you have any comments before we wrap it up. No? Okay.
I'm good.
All right, so stay tuned for the next episode. We are going to get into maybe a little bit of sparring over some terminology. We're going to talk about employees or human capital or whatever you may prefer that terminology to be. We're going to talk about it in December for our last episode of 2024, which I think is perfect timing as people are thinking about their end of year parties and celebrations and all of those things, and going into a new year and knowing how to appreciate and benefit your employees throughout the year. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.